Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Greetings, my friend.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
The story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, there's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, is given away by the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those ingredients that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, they lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try really hard not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema, an appreciation of how hard it is to make a film, and just me being grateful that somehow, through all the stories that we tell, films manage to come out the other side of them. In this episode, then, I'm just going to get cracking. I'm taking you back to 1994 to start with, a real favourite movie of mine. I'm going to set it up, as always, with a clip, and I'm going to come to the tail of it, the other side of this.
Tim Burton, director of Batman, Beetlejuice, and Edward Scissorhands, now takes you to a completely different world. The true story of a Hollywood legend, Ed Wood.
And action!
He made movies like no one else.
You want to keep moving. You've got to get through that door. Ah, that was perfect.
Perfect. Do you know anything about film production?
Well, I like to think so.
He had an eye for talent.
I met Bela Lugosi.
Well, I thought he was dead.
This is the most uncomfortable coffin I've ever been in.
No, he's very much alive. You flying saucer?
He had a passion for storytelling.
Get me transvestites. I need transvestites.
You're flashy. They want that. Okay. But they want professionalism, so nix on the Nelly without losing naivete.
What kind of a movie is this?
It's science fiction. A heartbreaking romance. Brave robbers from outer space.
Brave robbers from what?
And he had a secret he couldn't hide.
I like to dress in women's clothing. Panties, sweaters, pumps. It's just something I do.
That, then, is a clip from 1994's Ed Wood, directed by Tim Burton, from a screenplay by Scott Alexander and Larry Karaszewski, and starring Johnny Depp, Martin Landau, Sarah Jessica Parker, Patricia Arquette, Jeffrey Jones, and Bill Murray. Now, the story of this one concerns a man who was regarded, certainly around the time the film was being made, he was frequently described as the worst filmmaker of all time, which he wasn't, but a film director called Edward D. Wood Jr. Also someone who clearly wasn't was Tim Burton, who in the early 1990s was really the fast-rising Hollywood talent. That he delivered 4 straight hits, the Pee Wee Herman movie, he'd done 1989's Batman, he'd done Edward Scissorhands, and he'd moved on to deliver the sequel Batman Returns as well. And there was kind of an understanding in early 90s Hollywood that if you did one big film for the studio, there was still space in there somewhere where you could do one for yourself. And Burton had been working on very, very sizable productions at this point, and he had the clout really to get a passion project going. But it wasn't just his passion project this would turn out to be, because let's rewind to screenwriters Larry Karaszewski and Scott Alexander, who'd met while they were studying, and at this point they'd been behind the script of the modest hit Problem Child, which would also spawn a sequel as well. And for years they'd been talking about writing a film about Edward D. Wood Jr., who, as I said at the time, was regarded as the worst film director who ever lived, off the back of his films that he'd written, directed and sometimes starred in, such as Plan 9 from Outer Space and Glenn or Glenda. I mean, the latter, he played the lead role, exploring his own cross-dressing as he did so. And his films over time had, he was an outside misfit in Hollywood, and his films over time had got a cult reputation. They'd come to the attention of Burton, certainly, but at this stage, they'd come to the attention of Karaszewski and Alexander. And they were fearful that they were going to get pigeonholed as writers of kids' movies if they weren't careful. And so they decided to start putting together a treatment for Ed Wood. And they thought that this would, at this stage, be a low-budget film. And as they explained in an interview with the website Money into Light, when we did Ed Wood, we felt the biopic genre needed a kick in the ass. And they went on to explain that there were many what they described as cradle-to-the-grave movies out there. And instead, rather than doing that, what they wanted to do was focus on the structure, to quote them, how to take a person's life and turn it into a movie, explaining it's not an easy thing to do, and many people tend to get it wrong. And they said, we always ask the question, why are we telling the story? And the answer to that question is usually the climax of the film. We were telling the story of Ed because he was famous for making the worst movie of all time, Plan 9 from Outer Space, which dates back to 1959. And so him making the film was our film's climax. And so their idea, I mean, they started mapping it out on paper, and the first filmmaker they showed it to was a director by the name of Michael Lehmann. Now, Lehmann, at this stage, had Heathers to his name, a real cult success that as well, and it's gone on to be a stage musical now. Its reputation continues to soar. But also around this time, he was making 1991's Hudson Hawk, which was his move into blockbuster filmmaking that didn't go well. I've covered it previously on this podcast. And as Karaszewski and Alexander would say, we joked that it would be funny that Ed Wood was going to be the director of Hudson Hawk and the writers of Problem Child, making a film about the worst filmmaker of all time. Looking back to Heathers, though, which a well-received film, then Lehmann's producer on that film was Denise Denovi, and Denise Denovi, in turn, had now become Tim Burton's producer, and so there was a link in there. But in the first instance, it was going to be Lehmann to direct, but Karaszewski and Alexander also sent the script to Tim Burton because they weren't daft. I mean, this was a tactical move. You've got a far better chance of making the script made if you've got the weight of the name of a high-profile filmmaker on there. And who better than Tim Burton to shepherd this project through? And so Burton agreed. He was then attached as producer for a while because, as Mark Salisbury explores in his excellent Burton on Burton book, which is published by Faber, he was juggling a different project at the time, that he had agreed to do a film called Mary Riley for Columbia Pictures as his next big production. And Mary Riley was a real hope for Columbia at that stage. It had enjoyed success with Bram Stoker's Dracula at the start of the decade, and this was felt like a kind of extension into that world, a high budget film that would eventually be made with Julia Roberts in there. But Columbia wanted that relatively quickly, and Tim Burton didn't want to work at that pace. He certainly didn't want to be pushed along the way that studios have a habit of doing once their foot's on the accelerator. And so he was umming and ahhing about this, to the point where in the end he decided to duck out of Mary Riley. He'd been on it for a little while, and in fact Stephen Frears would take that project up. I will come to it in more detail in a future podcast. I've also talked to Stephen Frears on a previous episode of Film Stories, which you can hear him talk about his unhappy experience on that movie. It sounded like Tim Burton dodged a little bit of a bullet there. But Burton also then, at this point, took a look at Karaszewski and Alexander's treatment that they'd written. And as he remembered in an interview he gave to Cinefantastique magazine, its October 1994 edition, he said, I was staying at a farmhouse out near Poughkeepsie, and I started to read. Now, he'd also reading at this stage the Ed Wood biography, Nightmare of Ecstasy, and he said that's where I found out that Ed was from Poughkeepsie, and I started to get into it thematically. There were a lot of things happening that I could relate to, and he said I was thinking about doing the movie after hanging out there, and a little bit too about reading about Ed. And so this was now going to take some wriggling, because as Mary Riley fell apart for Burton, there was a moment to get Ed Wood moving at great speed. The problem was they only had a treatment at this stage. They didn't have a workable screenplay, and so Karaszewski and Alexander were asked to turn a script around for this quickly. The draft that they wrote in 6 weeks flat weighed in at nearly 150 pages. So in screen time, that's generally regarded as 2.5 hours. And they'd done it to such a speed that it meant that Ed Wood was now a project that Burton could fast track. And certainly now that it looked like he was going to have time in the schedule to make it, what with Mary Riley, for him at least, falling apart. Separately to this as well, Michael Lehmann was also getting busy, that he was committed to making his next movie, Airheads, and at the speed it now looked like Ed Wood might move, well, Lehmann couldn't have directed this if he wanted to, but he agreed anyway as Burton's interest began to soar in the project to take a producer credit on the movie. He would go off to make Airheads, and all of a sudden, Burton was far more interested in directing this one himself. because he'd been doing his research, he'd been making notes about Edward D. Wood Jr., and he realised he really liked the characters. He really wanted to tell the story, and in particular, he was drawn to the relationship between Bela Lugosi and Edward D. Wood Jr., Lugosi being an actor who Wood came to towards the end of his career, and the two of them would make quite a duo, really. And that would be the heart of the story. So, as per Karaszewski and Alexander's intent, this was now an unconventional biopic and an optimistic one as well. And so we get to April 1993, and Columbia was initially okay with the idea of doing Ed Wood and was happy to stump up the $18 million it was going to cost to make the film. Quite low budget by that period of time. But Mark Canton, the studio boss, then had a bit of a panic. Because Canton was, he was betting heavily on the summer of 1993 on a couple of films. One was a co-production, In the Line of Fire. Well, that worked out really well. But the other, his big ticket movie was Last Action Hero, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. Again, covered in a previous podcast. That didn't go so well, but in April 1993, that seemed like a really smart bet. Canton would pull the plug on Columbia's involvement in Ed Wood in April 1993, though, and the sticking point was a conversation between him and Tim Burton over shooting Ed Wood in black and white, because Canton was willing to move and cede to that, really, and would agree to let Burton have a black and white movie. But in exchange, he wanted a deal that gave Columbia Pictures first dibs on future Tim Burton projects. Now, Tim Burton at this stage had some degree of clout. He'd come off the Batman films. He'd made profits out of small movies, Edward Scissorhands and Beetlejuice, and turned them into really sizable hits. And so he turned Canton's offer down, and Canton in return responded by backing out of the Ed Wood deal. And as Burton would explain in the Burton on Burton book, he said, I'm in this meeting and they're crowing about their big hit Last Action Hero, all egotistical and stuff. And I'm thinking, I'm glad you people know so much. Egotism, that's something I can't tolerate in a field where you don't know shit. Nobody knows shit. That's what it says here. God, that's a naughty word. And so the thing was, with Columbia putting Ed Wood into turnaround around a month away from the start of shooting as well, it was nonetheless a project that was still in demand, with studios such as Paramount, 20th Century Fox, Universal and Touchstone Pictures considering swooping in for it. Now, people were realistic. An $18 million black and white film, that wasn't going to be a box office juggernaut. But two things. Number one, did you want to be in the Tim Burton business? Well, yes. Number two, did you see the awards potential in a film like this? Well, yes. To be fair to Mark Canton as well, as Variety reported back in 1993, there were legitimate problems with the black and white issue. The Variety report says studio output deals with cable companies often exclude black and white movies, and foreign television companies are equally reluctant to pony up the big bucks for such pictures. And with the subject matter being niche already, all of these things would have been playing in Canton's mind too. But at this stage, the other offers were coming in, but Burton had a relationship with Disney. Not just because of a much earlier relationship where he worked relatively unsuccessfully. It didn't end well as an animator at Disney, working on films such as The Fox and the Hound. But Disney at this stage was backing his animation project, Henry Selick's The Nightmare Before Christmas. And he and Burton and producer Denise Denovi had also set up a comedy there called Cabin Boy, starring Chris Elliott and Ricky Lake, that Burton didn't want to direct himself. And so he was making films within the Disney infrastructure at that stage. And even though Disney in the early 1990s was regarded as a frugal studio, some may say tight, I will go with frugal for the point of this, the $18 million price tag was felt to be reasonable. But also Burton was willing to take a cut himself. He worked strictly for scale on this. In exchange, though, he got complete creative control over the project. He would get his film in black and white. He didn't want a salary, but he wanted his choice of cast as well. And that cast would, as you heard, include Johnny Depp returning after working on Edward Scissorhands, Sarah Jessica Parker in there, Patricia Arquette, a cameo from Bill Murray, and his role was beefed up once he came on board. And Martin Landau would come in as Bela Lugosi. I'll talk about him just in a second. But also Burton brought in non-actors as well. George the Animal Steele, Lisa Marie Presley were on his radar for it. And he went into all of this, pulling it all together, and just thought it was a cheaper film. This is going to be easier to get off the ground than his other movies. He was incorrect on that, but now he finally had a green light. He had his financing, and so he could press ahead with making the film. So going back to the casting of Martin Landau in the film, going back also to that Cine Fantastique article in its October 1994 issue, a whole load of coverage in that back issue. What a find that was. And Landau explained, Tim called me out of the blue. And he said, when I read the screenplay, I said, whoa, I love the script. It was funny and tragic, and the character is so rich. But Landau, who known at this stage, best known probably for the Mission Impossible TV series, would also recognise it was a very complicated part because he felt everybody knows who Bela Lugosi is. His screen persona is so well known. His movies are still out there. He's a totally recognisable human being, and I have to convince people that I'm him. Well, that was no easy task, really, because he didn't quite look like him. So enter stage left makeup wizard Rick Baker, who would do makeup tests with Martin Landau on this one. And it was those tests, actually, to a point that convinced Burton to go black and white, because there came a question over, well, what colour should we do Bela Lugosi's eyes? What contact lenses do we need? And Burton just didn't know. But he also figured he didn't have to know. And certainly, I mean, he didn't. It was a gap he didn't have to fill in. And going in black and white would mean that these questions could remain unanswered and they add to the feel of the film. And so going back to what Landau was saying, he just said Rick Baker's makeup taught us a lot. He said, I didn't want a heavy makeup. I wanted something minimal so I have freedom with my face. And so Landau explained, Rick designed a nose and we got rid of my upper lip, which is very abundant, while Lugosi's was thin. Then we added ears over mine because Lugosi had mammoth ears. He also had a cleft in his chin, so we added that and added a little to my eyebrow. And it was becoming quite a makeup job, this. But still, filming had only been delayed slightly by the change of studio. It was now going to get underway in Los Angeles on the 5th of August 1993. Just ahead of filming, Burton consciously didn't revisit the movies of Ed Wood, and instead he was going to go on instinct here on his memories of watching the movies of Ed Wood. That there were some recreations of key moments from the film's plan, so obviously they'd have to go into a bit more detail there, but he wanted to get more the feel than be absolutely 100% accurate. He also went into filming knowing that he wanted to go sparser than usual with this. He wanted to lean into that whole idea that this is not a traditional biopic. And as he would admit to Cine Fantastique, he said, I got more away from storyboards on this one. And he said, obviously on an effects picture, you board a lot more. On a picture like this, I find you don't need to storyboard. You're working mainly with actors and there's no effects going on. So it's best to be more spontaneous. And he would explain that with the making of this film, they were a little bit more on the spot in the way that they shot the movie. For Johnny Depp, the way that he tailored his performance, well, there were a few influences that he drew on, and perhaps not obvious ones either. Because when he was looking to capture the voice of Wood, what he tried to do was blend two different sources. So one of them was former actor and American President Ronald Reagan, and certainly his blind optimism that was sometimes in his voice. But also the other person he was looking at was a man called Casey Kasem. And Casey Kasem had been a disc jockey, but also, if you go back to the very original Scooby-Doo cartoon series, Kasem was the person who provided the voice of Shaggy in that as well. Depp also didn't want to cheat on the cross-dressing nature of Edward D. Wood Jr. either. And he would explain in an interview with MTV, for instance, he said, the first thing I learned is that Angora feels amazing on someone else, but not on you. And he said the fuzzy material has an annoying habit of shedding profusely, but it didn't stop him looking to explore that side of the role and make sure that it was presented sensitively, which went into the tonal choices that they were making with the entire Ed Wood movie, that it would be very easy to have made a film of him that would ridicule him, but there was genuine affection from those making the movie towards Edward D. Wood Jr. Here is a person who carried on making his films despite the derision of some in Hollywood, who genuinely believed he was making really, really good films and threw his heart and soul into it. For Martin Landau, though, well, he on this film, well, he was having to put up with very, very long makeup days just to get ready for his shooting schedule. That Rick Baker and his team would spend several hours transforming him into Bela Lugosi. And Landau had already put the homework in as well, that he, even before the start of production, he dug out an awful lot of Bela Lugosi films, and he'd bought Hungarian language tapes as well. And he really, really wanted to capture this as authentically as possible, although in the aftermath of the film's release, Bela Lugosi Jr. would be quite critical, really. In fact, Rick Baker talks about this on a podcast that he did with the late Gilbert Gottfried, about how Lugosi Jr. was just taking issue with some of the ways that his father was depicted, but Baker also was fairly circumspect that it was a film they were making. They were having to make some concessions to cinema and making it all look right, and he didn't need to be an exact replica of Lugosi, even though he got his mannerisms really, really quite close. The filming of Ed Wood wrapped up on the 17th of November 1993, just as The Nightmare Before Christmas movie actually was being released in the US for the first time. But it was that Nightmare Before Christmas movie also that meant a surprising change came about in the post-production of Ed Wood. Because Tim Burton, for all of his previous films to that point, had worked with composer Danny Elfman, an incredible pairing that it had been. Elfman's score to the original Batman film, Elfman's score to Edward Scissorhands, I mean, both considered rightly very, very highly regarded in the world of movie scores. But on Nightmare Before Christmas, their working relationship had become a lot more strained, that they'd gone through the mill more on that project. And I mean, bottom line, they'd had a falling out to the point where their working relationship paid a heavy price for a short period of time. So Burton didn't offer this one to Elfman. It's unclear whether Elfman would have taken it anyway, and just whether they were on talking terms at this point. And instead he would turn to Howard Shore to put together the score for the movie. I think it's a terrific score as well for Ed Wood, but this would be, I mean, thankfully a temporary blip in the relationship breakdown between Burton and Elfman, and by the time they came to Mars Attacks a few years later, Elfman was firmly back on board, and they've been working together ever since. With that complete creative control then, Ed Wood was ready for festival season in the autumn of 1994, and in fact it would make its debut at the New York Film Festival on the September the 23rd of that year. And the critical response to this was really ecstatic, and rightly so as well. I think there's a strong argument, and I'd certainly subscribe to it, that this is Tim Burton's best film. And the fact that they'd gone with the tone they did came in for enormous praise. The performances came in for enormous praise as well. And the movie would also end up on lots and lots of top 10 lists. And the feeling was this has got a real Oscar run to it as well. First of all, though, it had to run the gauntlet of the US box office. And would there be interest in a black and white film about basically the director of the worst film ever made, if you go with that particular, if you subscribe to that particular way of thinking? And, you know, would people turn up to see it? And the answer to that was a pretty uniform no, as it turned out. Now, Ed Wood opened only in the way that studios do as they're trying to build up interest in awards films in particular. Ed Wood only opened on 2 screens that weekend, September the 30th to October the 2nd. Its screen average was incredible, $35,000, by distance the highest in the chart. But with it finished in 16th place on its opening weekend, a $71,000 opening gross. The same weekend that The River Wild opened in first place with $10 million, that Jason's Lyric opened up that week as well. But the plan was, well, if this goes well, word of mouth on Ed Wood will grow, gradually up the screen count, which they did the following week. Disney moved it up to 623 screens, and Ed Wood broke into the top 10. Never mind that Sylvester Stallone and Sharon Stone, with an icky fruity scene in a shower, were topping the chart with $14 million, and the rom-com Only You was opening with $5 million. Ed Wood added $1.9 million, finished in 9th place. But could it get some momentum? Could the award talk continue to build? And the problem was it didn't really, because it was out of the top 10 the following week. I mean, Pulp Fiction came out the week after. I mean, that didn't really help. And there was a very, very competitive awards window opening up. This was the year of, as well as Pulp Fiction, this was the year of The Shawshank Redemption, of Forrest Gump, of Quiz Show. And, you know, films were coming thick and fast. Stargate was around a couple of weeks later, and Ed Wood was just dropping out of the chart, to the point where it grossed 5.8 million in total in the US. And it only did about 7 or 8 million outside of the US as well. Its box office gross 13.8 million off the $18 million budget. But still, don't worry, Oscar nominations are coming, and Ed Wood duly picked up a couple of them as well. It only in 2 categories in the end, bizarrely. Best makeup for Rick Baker, V. Neil and Yolanda Tosing, and also Best Supporting Actor for Martin Landau. But come the Academy Awards on March 27th, 1995, it took home both gongs. In particular, Martin Landau's was seen as a little bit of a surprise because that was the year Samuel L. Jackson was expected to win for Pulp Fiction. But it was Landau that prevailed, and even though it had been shut out of pretty much every other category, in spite of being in the top 10 lists of lots and lots of critics around the world, Ed Wood would end up with 2 Oscars out of 2, a little bit of red ink on the Disney balance sheet, but it did ignite a little bit more enthusiasm in the work of Edward D. Wood Jr., and to this day, Burton is believed to regard it as the favourite of all of the films that he made. Now, one little postscript to this is ordinarily a film like this could make up a bit of money on home formats, and Ed Wood did indeed get a VHS release, but there was a problem with the release of the film on DVD, certainly in the US. And if you think that the DVD format sprung up in 96, 97, it wasn't until about 2004 that a DVD release came out, because previous releases had either been cancelled and withdrawn at the very last minute, or there were said to be rights delays, and it was an odd tale of a film that should have been a fairly straightforward disc release that just didn't get one. The film lives on, and one of the things one of the reasons I've chosen this for this podcast is I do think this is an absolute flat-out undiscovered gem, and if you've got any interest in the work of Tim Burton, it is a film worth digging out. But it's also a really unconventional biopic, just as Alexander and Karaszewski intended, and they've gone on to do more true life stories, but the one they did in the aftermath of the success of Ed Wood was The People versus Larry Flynn, but that one is a story too, for another time. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. So I'm going to do my usual boring parish notices. I apologise in advance. If you like this podcast, there are 3 ways you can support it. I'm grateful for any way you choose to do so. If you want to financially support what we're doing, go to patreon.com/Simon Brew. If you put a couple of coins in the meter there, then you get an ad-free version of this podcast. You also get the podcast released early to you pretty much every week. You also find out all the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes as well. Or if you don't want to put any money in, absolutely fine. Please subscribe. Things like that really help small independent podcasts like this one. Ideally, too, leave a hugely positive review for us. That helps with algorithms and things that I don't understand. We also have print magazines that are for sale. Film Stories magazine and Film Junior. The current issue of Film Stories leads with Daniel Radcliffe. The current issue of Film Junior, which is for under 15s, leads with Matilda the Musical, which is heading to cinemas just a couple of weeks away at the time this podcast is being recorded. But that's enough of the parish notices. I'm going to move on to the second of the 2 films I'm going to talk about in this episode, and I'm going to another film that didn't do particularly well at the box office, but heck, the press tour ended up being a bit of a treat. Here's a clip. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
A most unspeakable charge has been brought against you.
Jacques Legris entered our home. He attacked me.
The accusation is false.
I am telling the truth.
The truth does not matter. There is only the power of men.
This should be settled quietly.
I'm innocent!
I request a duel to the death.
If you lose, your wife will suffer dire consequences.
One of us has lied. Let us let God decide.
You do not believe me.
I am risking my life for you.
You are risking my life so you can save your bride.
That then is a clip from 2021's The Last Duel, directed by Ridley Scott, screenplay by Nicole Holofcener, Ben Affleck and Matt Damon, based on Eric Jager's book The Last Duel, a true story of crime, scandal and trial by combat in medieval France, and a cast led by Matt Damon, Adam Driver, Jodie Comer and Ben Affleck. And so it was in 2004 that a writer by the name of Eric Jager published the novel The Last Duel, with its very long subtitle. And this was the story of a duel that took place in 1386 in France between two knights. Now, he'd come across this story himself in 2001 on a trip to Normandy, and there he'd had a conversation with a local historian who told the story of this last duel, the last of its kind to be sanctioned by the French government. And so Jager, just a writer, inevitably just like there's something tweaked in his head, and he dug into it a little bit more and pitched a book in and around this story. So Jager was teaching full time, but within a year this pitch had been picked up, and so he could get to work on writing the book, which was ready for publication in 2004. But this wasn't a case of it was a book that flew off the shelves and became a massive bestseller, because he would explain that there was a late delay to the publication of the title, and that delay moved its release right into the middle of the American presidential campaigning that was going on in 2004. And so sales were not that high. It turned out people didn't necessarily want to read a book about French history, just at the time that American history was being written before their eyes. However, there wasn't an American presidential election going on in Britain, and so to a degree it was the UK sales that really kind of helped this one, that the book took off a lot more here in the UK. And Jager explained this in a really interesting long form article at the website Inside Higher Ed, and it's well worth digging out, because by 2006 the book was now being circulated to movie studios with the idea that actually that there's a film in this. This feels like quite a cinematic story. And movie studios were agreeing, God, this is a film story that's going nice and easy, isn't it? And so by 2006, it was reported by Variety on its front cover, in print and everything, that Paramount Pictures was involved in this one, that Kevin Misha's company, Misha Films, had optioned the book, and get this, Martin Scorsese, as part of his production deal with Paramount at the time, was going to produce the film, and he was toying with directing it as well. Furthermore, a script was getting underway. Doug Young, who'd written the film Confidence, for instance, he was working on drafts with Jager, and this was a movie just heading forward. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? The thing was, though, this would be the first of 3 different periods during the development where the book was optioned by different parties, because this, in the case of the Paramount Scorsese project, well, it soon started petering out as Paramount's strategy changed and Martin Scorsese pursued other projects, ultimately away from the studio in the end, although he'd make films like Shutter Island with Paramount. The 2007-2008 writers' strike, the WGA strike in the US, that got in the way of the development of the film a little bit. But still, it was set up at Paramount for quite a long time. I mean, from what I can work out, it's about 6-7 years that the studio and Kevin Misha kept extending the option with Eric Jager. But eventually it was 2013 where Paramount was not having the best of times when it decided to drop the project. And one of the reasons it did decide to drop the project is Martin Scorsese decided to drop the project as well. At this stage, he was pursuing a different film, a passion project of his called Silence, that he would ultimately make. And so the rights for The Last Duel were back in some degree of flux. So let's bring in another face to the story. This one is Erwin Stoff. Now, he's a producer who'd worked on films like The Matrix and Austin Powers, and he'd seen a TV programme that Jager had been involved with surrounding the story of this Last Duel. And he too thought, hang on, there's a film in this, and he wanted the rights to the story. And so he arranged a meeting with Eric Jager, and he brought along a special guest with him. That special guest being Francis Lawrence. Now, Francis Lawrence in 2014, this is the man who directed like the last 3 Hunger Games films, and he had some commercial cachet to them. He'd done Constantine as well, of course. Water for Elephants is one of his too. That's an underrated little movie, that is, as well. But for the purposes of the meeting in 2004, Erwin Stoff, Eric Jager and Francis Lawrence were round a table. They had a long conversation about this. At the end of that conversation, Stoff declared that, he wanted the rights to this. And so he got in touch with the necessary people and took out an option on The Last Duel. Now, what this meant was starting all over again on the screenplay. And this time, there wasn't the collaboration that there'd been between Doug Young and between Eric Jaeger, because the writer hired this time was a man called Sean Grant. Now, Sean Grant had worked on a film called Snowtown, and he was hired to pen the new script for this. Francis Lawrence was going to direct. But Grant would write the script this time pretty much independently from Jaeger, that they had a conversation or two and the occasional question went in. But still, this time the author was very much on the sidelines of watching his project be adapted and head to the screen. Once again, though, the Hollywood machine was not moving at great speed here, and the option on the book was renewed a couple of times, but eventually again it would just drop out. And so by the time we get to 2019, the rights to The Last Duel were back in play. So let's go all the way back to the 1990s, the first screenplay written by two then upcoming actors, Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. That screenplay, the only credited one they'd both worked on together to that point, was Good Will Hunting. And of course, they took home Oscar Gold for that one. And they'd been making noises of another project that they could possibly come together on, but they'd not had an awful lot of luck working out what that is. However, as it turned out, both of them in the end read this book, The Last Duel. And what Damon told The Hollywood Reporter was they were really particularly taken by the idea of the perspectives around the story of a heroic woman of history. That there was something of the classic film Rashomon, viewing the same event from lots of different perspectives over the course of the movie. And so by the time at the start of 2019, Matt Damon wanted to option the book. That a producer at Damon and Affleck's company had found it, had pitched it to Damon, and so he was interested. What Damon was also doing was looking for another film he could make with the director Ridley Scott. Now, their last collaboration had been the movie The Martian, which had been a huge success for both of them. It got Best Picture Oscar nomination, for instance, a huge box office hit. And so Scott had directed, Damon had starred in that, and they were on the lookout for another film. And so Damon then took that to Scott, and Scott was interested. And so Scott Free Productions, Ridley Scott's production company, also agreed to come in and co-produce this. Scott Free Productions had an ongoing development deal at 20th Century Fox, by which Ridley Scott's films would primarily go through that studio. And so all of a sudden there looked like a much clearer path to the screen. Thing was, they needed to write it all over again because Sean Grant's script was now out of play. And so the plan this time was Ben Affleck and Matt Damon would come together and they would adapt Eric Jaeger's book. But what they realised is because the key character in this is a female one, the character being that of Marguerite de Carriget, that's the best French pronunciation I'm going to do. What they didn't want to do is have two blokes writing her story, and they realised they needed a female perspective in there. And so they put out a call to Nicole Holofcener, and the idea was that Affleck and Damon would write the male perspectives on the tale, and Holofcener would write the female perspective of the tale. This is how Damon explained the story to Jimmy Fallon on his chat show in the US. Now, Holofcener was coming off the back of the Oscar-nominated Can You Ever Forgive Me? She accepted the idea, and she would explain in a separate piece with The Hollywood Reporter that she found it was a really fun coming up with stuff and getting rid of stuff and trying stuff. And the character ultimately played by Jodie Comer, coming to her shortly, the idea that her relationship with her mother-in-law was really fun for me to write, Holofcener said. It was a horrible relationship, an abusive one, and it was really sad. But the scene towards the end of the movie, this is spoiler light, don't be scared, before the duel, that was really challenging, and we worked on that for quite a while with Jodie Comer to get that right. So the writing process was relatively smooth. Damon and Affleck, I mean, in contradiction to how they approached Good Will Hunting, where it was said they churned out lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of pages and then had to pull it all back. But they're far savvier about the movie industry now. They both also had kids. They both also had other projects, and they had their production company. So they were far more regimented in building in writing time into their days. And the script would come together with relative speed. And so then there was the matter of casting, because all of a sudden it looked like The Last Duel might be going ahead quite fast after its prolonged period in development hell. And so what are we up to? It's been over a decade just to get to this point. And Affleck and Damon were both mulling roles in the film. The lead male role, for instance, in the film, Legree, was one that Ben Affleck was considering for himself. Damon was also going to take on the other male lead. But there was also mindful that would be a distraction, having some kind of Damon versus Affleck movie, Batman versus Superman, something like that. Can you imagine? And that it might move the attention away from the screen and more towards the two actors. So they were a little bit wary of that, and whether casting both of them in lead roles was the right way forward. There was also, while they were mulling the production of this one, another problem that was happening in the background, another challenge to the very existence of the movie, and that's that 20th Century Fox, well, the parent company 21st Century Fox, was being bought up by Disney, of course, in a deal worth over $70 billion. And once that deal had been completed, Disney's executives went through the Fox slate and basically junked the vast majority of the films that Fox was working on, including shutting down two arms of 20th Century Fox completely, Fox 2000, that had been working on literary adaptations primarily, and Blue Sky Studios, the animation studio behind the likes of the Ice Age films. And so it's touch and go, really, whether The Last Duel was going to press ahead and survive the Disney cull. But by the summer of 2019, the key decisions were in, because Ridley Scott confirmed that, yeah, he's interested in this. And what do you know? He's going to direct it as well. And once you've got Ridley Scott directing, it would be fair to say he does not tend to wait around. And so if he says he's going to do it, and he says it's going to be his next film, he's going to do it, and it's going to be his next film. Because the script was pretty much done by the middle of 2019 as well, that Damon and Affleck both agreed that they would feature on screen in it. And so at the point where Disney had its decision to make, Deadline reported that, I'm told, every studio in town is waiting in the wings for this one. Ridley Scott had been planning to shoot a film called Merlin, about Merlin, wouldn't you know, which was going to be set up at Disney as well. But he was saying, if The Last Duel gets the go-ahead, I'm going to do that. We'll push Merlin back. At the time of recording this podcast in 2022, Merlin has not yet happened, and Ridley Scott is making a Napoleon film with Apple's money instead. But Disney basically decided, yeah, we're going to go with it. And this was one of the few films that survived that mass cull of movies. But they knew, Scott knew, Affleck knew, Damon knew that if Disney said no, they could ship this fairly easily somewhere else. And I wonder if that just changed Disney's decision a little bit. And so with the agreement from Disney to fund the bill for the movie, the price of it was going to come in around $100 million. So not massive, but also it's $100 million. That's massive to me. The casting came together, and Jodie Comer, for instance, she would take the lead female role in this. She'd been enjoying accolades off the back of Killing Eve in particular. She would sign up in September to take on the lead female role. Ben Affleck, meanwhile, he in the end decided, you know what, I'm going to take the supporting role in this, and that left the other lead male role open. As Variety thus reported in October 2022, Adam Driver was soon in talks to take that particular part on. And finally, with a cast in place after a very, very long period just mulling around the Hollywood system, The Last Duel could press ahead, and surely nothing else could go wrong. Right then, shooting began on February the 14th, 2020 in France. And the idea was that it was going to run for a few months, that a bulk of the shoot would take place in Ireland, and Matt Damon moved his family there for the duration of it. And then, of course, along came the pandemic. You might well have heard of its work. That left the film having to shut down, as many did. And in this case, The Last Duel's production shut down on March the 12th, 2020. And the idea was that hopefully this will clear up fairly quickly and we can get up and running again soon. Meanwhile, in that downtime, Ridley Scott got moving on his next film, House of Gucci, which I've covered before. But he was working with really, in some degree of parallel, he was working on these movies, even though Gucci wouldn't shoot until The Last Duel had wrapped up. What it meant was the two films would be released basically 2 months apart from each other, giving Ridley Scott an extended press tour to share his views on both films. We are coming to that shortly. So Scott had been approaching this, as he tended to do, with multiple cameras, and he was working quickly and efficiently. But of course, at the heart of The Last Duel, if you've not seen the film, this is the moment that it hinges on. I don't believe this is really a spoiler. There is a really quite horrifying sequence of rape, which is presented twice from two different perspectives in the film. And Jodie Comer talked about the filming of that. And I mean, she did say that she appreciated the efficiency of Ridley Scott as a director shooting that sequence. In a piece with The Hollywood Reporter, she said, "We started it in the morning and I honestly think we were off it before lunch," which is unheard of. But this went to Scott's fast, efficient, multi-camera way of shooting. And she said any other film or show, if you were shooting with two cameras, you could have been on that until the mid-afternoon, which is exhausting. There's obviously a substantial amount of money, she said, but you realise when you're working with someone like Ridley and you have that many cameras, you are really afforded that luxury. So I know we were all really, really grateful for that. And I want to acknowledge that the sequences, those two sequences in the film did cause some degree of consternation on the movie's release. And that may well have been a couple of the contributory factors to the mixed reception that the film ultimately got. In terms of coming back to life, the plan originally had been to get The Last Duel into cinemas in December 2020, but the COVID delays were inevitably taking their toll on that release date, which there's no way it could be met. And so Disney decided to put this one back to the autumn of 2021. Now, it was a few months later that filming could begin again on The Last Duel, and production in the end wrapped in October 2022. Then Ridley Scott quickly went into post-production, hot-footed it to the World of Jared Leto and the House of Gucci shoot, which he also took along Adam Driver to as well. And so that meant that he was finishing off The Last Duel, he was shooting his next movie, but still there was real anticipation for this one, especially because we've been so starved of big movies by the time we came to the autumn of 2021, which is when the film made its debut at the Venice Film Festival ahead of its cinema release in October 2021. The original response to the film, I mean, it was quite bright response, really. That there were problems with it. There was a feeling it was a little bit too long. The performances were praised. Ben Affleck's performance, actually, in particular, and his posh hair got a lot of attention. Jodie Comer, predictably brilliant. Generally, the film was coming out well from its critical response. Now, there was an expectation when it went into cinemas that, even appreciating we were in an era where cinema returns were muted, that, well, this should do all right, shouldn't it? No, it shouldn't. It landed into cinemas in October 2021 with an absolutely enormous thud. Now, I should note that even ahead of the release of the film, there'd been some mumblings that the marketing campaign for it was muted, that there were suspicions, or certainly there was conspiracy theories going around, that Disney was hardly putting in a massive shift to promote the films that it inherited from the Fox film library. But still, it could have stopped The Last Duel. It had the option to pull the plug. It had gone ahead with it. I can only talk from my perspective of walking around the UK. That makes me sound like I walked a long time. But just going through two cities in the UK and just barely seeing evidence that the film was coming up, and also reporting on a UK film website, and not getting an awful lot in and around The Last Duel. But still, Ridley Scott would declare himself content with the way that Disney had promoted the movie. But I don't think anyone really saw what was happening coming, because on that weekend of October the 15th to the 17th, 2021, The Last Duel opened in 5th place at the US box office with a $4.7 million opening weekend. And there was no way to spin that, really. That was poor. It wasn't even that some films weren't breaking through, because 2 weeks earlier, Venom, Let There Be Carnage, had opened with $90 million. The same weekend, Halloween Kills had opened with $49 million. Even in the family market, I mean, the Addams Family sequel, not the proper Addams Family sequel, the animated one, well, that was already up to $42 million in 3 weeks. People were watching films, but there was a growing concern that people weren't watching, inverted commas, adult films. Steady, not like that. Dramas aimed at older audiences. Had we become more conditioned to watching films on streaming services, and we just go to cinemas for the massive blockbusters? And others would fall prey to this theory. Things like King Richard would come along a month or two later to really strong reviews, but not really the box office returns to match it. The one that would break this, in fact, would be Ridley Scott's House of Gucci, which was a drama aimed at an adult audience, not like that, which did go on to make some decent money. But there was no way of just putting any kind of varnish on The Last Duel. It had done very, very, very badly. And by the time its box office run was done in the US, I mean, if we just look at the chart the following week, The Last Duel was down to 7th already. Dune came out for $41 million. By week 3, it was out of the top 10 altogether. And by the time its run was completed in America, $10.8 million at the US box office. And that is disaster territory, really, for a $100 million movie. It wasn't even tempered by the international box office returns of $19.6 million. Overall, the gross for the film was just over $30 million worldwide. And Disney would, it would just double down on the suspicions that Disney hadn't given this a full fair shift by bringing it to its Disney Plus streaming service very, very quickly. I think 45 days after its cinema release, it put it out on premium video on demand, although that was the way things had already gone by that point. And it was on Disney Plus, it felt like in double quick time, where it did pick up some kind of audience. Now, during the original press tour for The Last Duel, Ridley Scott was in full promotion mode. But the way that this press tour segued is it kind of merged with that for House of Gucci. And so Scott found himself talking about The Last Duel, even as the point where he was sat down for interviews for the House of Gucci movie. And in particular, a very infamous interview he gave on Mark Maron's WTF podcast, where he blamed the performance of The Last Duel on millennials, or millennium, as he said. And what he told Maron is, what we've got today, the audience who were brought on these, what does that say, clucking cell phones, he said. The millennium do not ever want to be taught anything unless you're told it on the cell phone, he raged. And already at this point, that he had told a Russian journalist as well to, what does that say, cluck you and go cluck yourself. When the journalist in question drew comparison with Scott's own Kingdom of Heaven and Robin Hood. And so, Scott was really on the rampage, defending his film and explaining why he felt it felt. He was happy with the movie. He was happy with the way he promoted it. It was the bloody millennials who just spoilt this for everybody. I had to look up what a millennial was. I'm not that well versed. Now, Ben Affleck would also give a considered response to the question of why is this not worked out in a later interview he did with the Hollywood Reporter. And he said that one of the fundamental ways it's changing is that the people who want to see complicated adult, not like that, non-IP intellectual property dramas are the same people who are saying to themselves, you know what, I don't need to go out to a movie theatre because I'd like to pause it, go to the bathroom, finish it tomorrow. And he said it's that, along with the fact that you can watch with good quality at home. It's not like when I was a kid and the TV at home was an 11-inch black and white TV. He said you can get a 65-inch TV at Walmart for $130. Can you? Crikey. There's good quality out there and people are at home streaming in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos. It's all changed. And his argument was that maybe the home was where films like this were going to sit, which has been mildly disproved and also quite proved in the time since. What didn't help The Last Duel was it didn't get any Oscar recognition either. In fact, it would be Ridley Scott's other film, House of Gucci, that would attract more interest from the Academy Awards. And so The Last Duel basically was left to fall, really, and it continued. It sits on the Disney Plus service and is a better film, I would suggest, than its reputation suggests. The duel at the end, which took 2 months of work just to prepare and build to, and then another couple of weeks just to shoot the thing, is as impressive as you would expect from a Ridley Scott movie. But the narrative of The Last Duel, a film, lest we not forget, that was in development for 10, 15 years before we got it, has been overtaken by what happened when it was released, as opposed to the focus remaining on the movie itself. Maybe over time it will find that audience. Ridley Scott certainly made better films. He certainly made worse films. If there was going to be a film in his back catalogue that would perform so badly at the box office, I'm not sure most of us would pick this one for it. It's out there to be discovered. The story behind it remains interesting, and I, for one, cannot wait for Ridley Scott's next press tour. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you so much for your time. If I've not bored you to bits, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories podcast at Film Stories Pod. We've got a website, filmstories.co.uk, which is where you can find a daily mix of movie news, reviews, features, mayhem, bad jokes, all the kind of things you might expect. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you can find our magazines for sale, as well as our sneakers Blu-ray that we've made here in the UK with fresh extra features as well. We're on YouTube at youtube.com/filmstories, and the Patreon is patreon.com/Simon Brew. For now, though, the most important thing remains that you all stay well, you all look after yourselves. I've got a whole host of special episodes coming up of Film Stories where I'm in conversation with a lot more filmmakers. I'll put more on that on the Patreon shortly. But for now, you all take care, you all look after yourselves, and I'll be back soon with another bunch of Film Stories. Bye-bye.